Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with a past guest, and now we're going to be talking about a whole different subject. Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name is Jeremy Kuzmarov. I'm a historian and I'm a managing editor with CovertAction magazine.
Now, I came across an article you wrote on CovertAction magazine about the Kennedy assassination. Can you maybe give a brief little summary about what you wrote about the Kennedy assassination and also why you wrote something like this?
Okay, well, yeah, I've written several articles. Actually, it was a series on political assassination that I developed for CovertAction magazine, and I'm planning to publish it in a book called American Political Assassinations in America. Oh, no, sorry. Well, Assassinations as American as Cherry Pie. So, and it kind of countered the myth of American exceptionalism. And actually, I quote the what I learned in doing some research is that the Warren Commission, when the Warren Commission was convening, Alan Dulles asked this historian named James Donovan to provide copies of his book. He wrote this book on political assassinations in America, and he advanced basically his argument was that political assassinations occur, in Russia and Japan, but America is unique, and that though we have assassinations, it's these lone, deranged gunmen, and he look, and he kind of sought to psychologically analyze them, and that was the narrative that Dulles wanted to promote, in the Warren Commission, that Oswald was this deranged lone assassin, and that there are previous cases, like the book went into cases like the assassination of William McKinley, the Lincoln assassination, the assassination of James Garfield. Uh, but my book totally counters that view. Even those cases, I've done some research, and it's a bit harder to find information, but there's evidence of conspiracies in those cases as well. The James Garfield, the McKinley assassination, and certainly the JFK assassination. Then I go into so many other assassinations like James Forrestal, the country's first defense secretary after World War II. He was very clearly assassinated. They tried to stage it to look like a suicide, but he was very clearly assassinated. You have all the assassinations of the 60s. You have the Vince Foster case. There's just so many cases. There's journalists who've been killed, like Danny Casolaro and Gary Webb, who were clearly assassinated. So I put it all together in my book just to challenge this idea of American exceptionalism, that our democracy is so pure and that change of power doesn't occur through violence, and that political figures who threaten to expose or unleash major scandals are also assassinated sometimes. Like in the case of Forrestal and Foster, they both had a lot of insider information on corrupt goings on. Forrestal with regard to Pearl Harbor, and also he, was part of a faction in the State Department that was against U.S. alliance with Israel because he feared that that would alienate the Arab world from the United States if they aligned too closely with the Israelis because of their mistreatment of Palestinians. And then he was conveniently killed as the U.S. shifted towards unfettered support for Israel. And in Foster's case, yeah, he was an insider with the Clintons at the Rose law firm, and he knew all about the MENA drug, arms smuggling and money laundering operations. So anyway, I think I put it together. No, there are a lot of individual books on assassination, but this would be the first to just show the systematic pattern of conspiracies in American history. So the Kennedy assassination is obviously a crucial one, and it should be regarded as a coup d'etat. And the research I have done would indicate that Lyndon Johnson was at the forefront of the conspiracy with Texas oil barons and businessmen who tied their fortunes to Johnson, as well as disaffected elements of the CIA who had it in for Kennedy for a variety of reasons. Some, I believe, may have been personal or careerist reasons, other may have been ideological, who participated in that uh, conspiracy.
Could I ask or maybe some evidence you can give me on LBJ's connection or how you found that LBJ was kind of behind it.
Sure. Well, and I credit Robert Morrow wrote a book on the Clintons with Roger Stone, the Clintons' War on Women, and somehow I got connected with him, and he's done a tremendous amount of research. He lives in Austin, Texas, and he knows a tremendous amount about LBJ and his role in the assassination. So it was through my relationship with him that I came to see Johnson's role. And there's a significant book written by Barr McClellan. Although the book has some flaw that I forget the name now off the top of my head, the title of the book, but it looks Barr McClellan was the do you
I think
know
it's called Blood, Money, and Power.
yeah, exactly. That's it. And that's a very illuminating book because McClellan was an insider. He worked for the law firm that represented Lyndon Johnson, and he was told by some of the partners in the firm about Johnson's involvement and others in the law firm, particularly Ed Clark, who is known as like a political boss of Texas and was very close to LBJ. And he said that he got, as a reward for his coordination of it, that he got oil leases, lucrative oil leases, and he was appointed U.S. ambassador to Australia when Johnson became president, and that he and a guy, Don Thomas, participated in coordinating the assassination. And yeah, David H. Byrd was another key figure that I looked into, and I did this recent article about Byrd. And he wasn't too shy about it because he kept a trophy in his home, a replica of the sniper's nest on the sixth floor of the Texas School Book
Which
Depository.
is it's still debated too. I looked into that, and apparently they don't know. The family claims that it's real. Some people say it's a replica, but they think that it could be the sixth floor window. It was going up at auction, I think. What was it, like 2017 or 2015 or something like that?
Yeah. So, but yeah, Byrd seems to have played a very significant role, and he was an oil billionaire who also was connected with the CIA. He owned E-Systems, which was a company that manufactured spyware and that ultimately bought over part of Air America. Um, and he had, I think, one other company that was tied to the CIA. So, yeah, he's, I guess, a nexus between Johnson, the Texas oil interests and billionaires behind him, and the CIA. And his ownership of the Texas School Book Depository was crucial because in setting up Oswald as the patsy, they set him up with a job at the school book depository. I guess they may have given him instructions as far as what he should be doing on that day. And apparently, I learned from my research is that the Texas School Book Depository was a front for intelligence operations, that the textbooks they were producing, yeah, double check in the article, but I remember discussing this that yeah, I think some of those textbooks were really intelligence related, and it was part of a larger intelligence operation. So again, there's that connection with Byrd in the intelligence world as well as the Texas Oil and Johnson, because he was very close to Lyndon Johnson. There's even some photos of them, attending University of Texas football games together. They had, yeah, very close connections. So, and yeah, the Texas School Book Depository was obviously central in the plot, especially, I mean, well, as an expert on this topic, that really, Kennedy was shot from the front, and those shots were more of a diversion, kind of like the Sirhan in the Robert Kennedy assassination. But it was very vital, part of the assassination. So Byrd is obviously a key figure. And yeah, I mean, as far as Johnson, the evidence, just looking into the politics, Johnson clearly was going to be dropped by the Kennedys in the 64 election. And, Johnson hated the Kennedys and the Kennedys hated Johnson. I believe there's evidence that the only reason they selected him as the vice president in 1960 was because they were blackmailed, that Johnson and Sam Rayburn and that through his friendship with, because Johnson was very close friend with J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover had surveilled the Kennedys and had all the dirt on their sexual misadventures, and they really led these Clinton type, sex life, and a lot of sexual deviancy going on there. So even, affairs with Marilyn Monroe, and there, question marks about her murder. So, Hoover had all kinds of dirt. So I think Johnson, Rayburn, and possibly Hoover, Rayburn was Johnson's colleague in the Senate. They blackmailed Kennedy that they would release this and ruin them unless he was appointed the vice president. But then in 62, a number of Johnson's top financiers and cronies were being implicated in major financial scandals. Like Billy Saul Estes, who ultimately spent 20 years in prison, was a key Johnson donor and financial bagman in Texas. But he was involved in all kinds of fraudulent agricultural schemes, and he got caught for that. Yeah. And 62, he was facing a grand jury indictment and eventually went to prison for a long time. Bobby Baker was Johnson's top aide. He was involved in a major scandal, including setting up brothels for congressmen, and he went to prison. So this was all coming out, in 62, 63. And there was also a bribery that was being uncovered in the Congress. There were hearings over a contract to General Dynamic that was obtained through fraud and payoffs to Johnson, who helped secure that contract. And there was a congressional investigation about that. And Don Reynolds was, I think, worked for one of the aerospace companies, had insider knowledge, and he was testifying before Congress. Apparently, he was threatened by Johnson and had to leave the country when Johnson became president. There's a new book coming out about that. But anyway, all these scandals were unfolding around Johnson, and it was starting to look bad. This was coming out in the media, and the Kennedys realized Johnson was becoming a huge liability for the 64 election. And apparently Robert Kennedy, they each played the same game where they have their surveillance networks and opposition research. So Kennedy had a huge file on Johnson and his corrupt practices in the state of Texas going back to 1930s. And there are a lot of dark skeletons in Johnson's closet, including his cheating in 1948 Senate race. And this has been corroborated that
It's the
he
Box
cheated.
13 scandal.
Exactly. And then he may have killed people to cover that up. There's the case of Smithwick, a local sheriff in that East Texas county who had all this insider information about the election theft. And he went to prison on another charge, but he ended up being, he was found hanging himself after he hung himself in prison. But most felt it was a murder. And the governor of Texas at that time accused Johnson of the murder, Sam Smithwick, and there's a lot of evidence that he ordered Smithwick's murder to cover up the election fraud. And then there were other killings in Texas, including of a federal official with the agricultural department who was investigating Billy Saul Estes. So the Kennedys had all this information that could have landed, not only ruined Johnson's political career, had him dropped from the 64 ticket, but put him under federal investigation and possibly being at risk of being sent to prison for the rest of his life. So, and Johnson said he was a gambling man, and his only move at that point was to take out the Kennedys and become president, and then set up the Warren Commission to whitewash that crime, and that would give him impunity for all the other crimes he committed. And then, yeah, I think the McClellan book is very significant in identifying Ed Clark and Don Thomas and discussing their role in coordinating it with elements of the CIA. With Byrd, I think, being an important liaison with the CIA. And then you have certain CIA figure like General Edward Lansdale, who were probably involved because his photo, 3 people identified him leaving the scene of Dealey Plaza within a few hours of the assassination. And he was a known CIA assassin, and he had a personal vendetta against the Kennedys. So he was probably a key figure in coordinating it.
I'm gonna ask more about Bird a little bit later on, but I want to get kind of more thoughts on Johnson's background here. Now, were you aware of any of this stuff about Johnson? Because I didn't find out about this until after I started researching the Kennedy stuff about the Box 13 scandal, his connections with Big Oil, and how powerful Big Oil wasn't just not only Texas but influential into our politics. So I'm curious. Obviously, names like Mac Wallace and others that start to pop up when you start looking at Lyndon B. Johnson, but you need to have, I guess the question always really comes up, which is who would have gained from killing Kennedy? And to be honest, a lot of people did gain from killing Kennedy or Kennedy's death in general, not just LBJ, but plenty of others. J. Edgar Hoover got to be director for life. Other Harold Bird owned a famous building after that. There's a lot of things that started to occur. I'm just curious when it came to Johnson's background, were you privy to any of this information before the whole Kennedy subject? And then what about LBJ gave you prior motive evidence or just prior evidence in general that he has a track record of doing this already? I mentioned Mac Wallace, it's his personal hitman, but there's a lot of things where people that stood in Johnson's way, and I think you can even see photos of the famous Johnson treatment, where he doesn't seem like a type of person that is easily dismissed or being able to be pushed or attacked, and he doesn't hold a grudge. He seemed like he held a big grudge against a lot of people, and he knew how to handle those situations.
Well, yeah, I didn't know too much about it. I mean, I studied American history. I took courses in college, read a lot of the books, but usually that dark side of the history is not taught. It's maybe touched on a little bit in some courses and some books.
We'd have more college graduates if that was taught in college, I tell you that much.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Robert Caro did a huge biography of Lyndon Johnson, and I read several of the volume, particularly the one dealing with his background. I didn't read everything about his presidency because those books are huge. You get tired of reading. I like to read, but after a while, but the ones on his background do have some good, pretty critical insights on Johnson's connection to figure like George Brown and Herman Brown and Brown and Root. But then yeah, when I got connected with Robert Morrow, he knew much more about the dark side of Johnson, and he pointed me to some sources and books, like older books. There's a book, A Texan Looked at Johnson. It was written, I guess it was kind of dismissed by liberal academics or historians because he was a conservative critic of Johnson, but he was from Texas. J. Evetts Haley, and he had a lot of dirt on Johnson. And this book was like written in the 1960s. And there was another book by Penn Jones on Johnson and murders. So when you read that stuff, and there are other books, they're kind of more obscure books that aren't widely cited or hard to find, but you can get them on Amazon, or if you have sometimes you can find a reasonable price on Amazon, or if you have a library that does interlibrary loan, they'll get it for you. So I got a number of those books, and some of them are written a long time ago, like in the 60s. So there was a lot of good information there, and there was a couple articles Morrow pointed to me in the Texas Monthly about written like in the 80s about Johnson's role in the murder of Henry Marshall. Uh, so there is documentation of it, and there are articles and books. They're just a little more obscure, but they're referenced. See, I wrote an article in CovertAction magazine that anybody interested in this topic can consult because it gives a kind of concise overview of what we know about Johnson and these crimes he committed in Texas. I think it's titled "Was Johnson a Serial Killer?" Something like that in CovertAction magazine. And then it references all these sources that you can look up. Some may be available on the internet, books, or through the open library. There's a way to read books sometimes for free online. So yeah, I slowly learned more about it. And yeah, Johnson was a very vulgar guy. Like I learned in my research that he would do things that you wouldn't do in normal civilized company. Like he was just like a grotesque man who would even whip out his private part or
They called him Bull Balls. That's what they called him. He hated that nickname, but they called him it.
yeah. And from a young age, he was like even he was a troublemaker as a youth, and he did things that one might associate with a psychopath. Like as a youth, him and a friend put dynamite in the town center of Johnson City. They attached dynamite to a dog and blew up the dog and thought this was funny. So he displayed tendencies of psychopathy. And then when he was in college, he rigged the elections to become student president. And like people who knew him said that's who he was. He was just anything for power, and that he was really a scary guy. And he had the making of a dictator. And yeah, he was a very big and imposing man. He was kind of like a bully. I guess he was somewhat effective as Senate Majority Leader. He could get stuff passed through the Johnson treatment, maybe through some of his bullying methods. And he was very cunning, calculating, Machiavellian. So he rose to the top, but he had no morality behind him. And the evidence would indicate, yeah, that had committed murders before, and so he was willing to do the ultimate crime to gain the presidency. And yeah, Mac Wallace, I do discuss that in my article on Johnson's past. And yeah, Mac Wallace, I think, became loyal to Johnson because he was connected with his sister in these like libertine sexual movement of that time. It was kind of like an
Josepha.
underground. Yeah, Josepha Johnson. I think he had an affair with her, but and he had been the student president of the University of Texas, and he actually led a movement again. There was some professors who were fired because they were seen as too liberal, like some economists, and the president of the University of Texas fired them because they were too liberal. So he stood up for the fired professors, and he became a well-known student leader in the 40s. And he was a very bright guy who became an economics professor. But then, yeah, he was involved in these, I guess, underground sex clubs with Johnson's sister, and then got into some trouble and killed a man. I think it was over a feud about a woman. And so Johnson helped save him. He was up for the death penalty. And Johnson, I guess he had some ties to Johnson. So Johnson saved him, and he got an extremely light sentence where he didn't, I think he didn't serve any prison time, even though he killed the man. But
Well, he was
that made,
convicted 5 years, and he was released within. I think it was released right after that. Like it was not even a day. He didn't even spend a day. He's the only person in Texas to have that, and it was because LBJ put his. Now I don't know because this isn't verified 100%, but he apparently was in the hotel right across from where the court thing was happening, but watching it all or something like that. But he put his lawyer, and there is photos of at Mac Wallace's trial. There is photos of like a close personal aide who's there with Billy Celestes at his trial. Then he's also standing around LBJ at like I forgot whose birthday party. One of the big oil guys. I think his name is something Sid Richardson. That's his name. Sid Richardson, a big oil man from Texas. Who necessarily he died before Kennedy was there, but obviously if you know about the name Clint Murchison and all those people that get involved when it comes to the LBJ theory, there's photos of all of them together.
yeah. And so, yeah, since LBJ pulled the strings, and that made Wallace totally loyal to Johnson and beholden to him, and he can use him how he wanted. And he secured a J, and somehow he got a top security clearance after being convicted of murder. He got a top security clearance and went to work for LTV. And yeah, see, Byrd had stocks. This was a major defense contractor that manufactured airplanes ultimately that were used in the Vietnam War. And Wallace got a security clearance, and Byrd had huge stocks in that. Wallace worked for them, and then yeah, Johnson used him to do some of his bag jobs and dirty work, including probably assassinations. Yeah, he was fingered in the Henry Marshall murder, although Robert Morrow and I have discussed this, and he believed that the sketch of the man actually looked like Billy Sol Estes and Billy Sol Estes's brother. And Morrow believed that Billy Sol Estes may have carried out the killing of Henry Marshall or Billy Sol's brother, and not necessarily Wallace in that case. But Wallace, yeah, his girlfriend or wife said he knew LBJ very well, and that LBJ was closer to him maybe than his own wife. But then Wallace died under very suspicious circumstances, and he may have been run off the road and murdered himself in the early 70s because he knew too much.
No autopsy done either. Apparently,
Yeah.
say what they say, a massive heart attack or something like that. Which I think all heart attacks are usually pretty severe or massive. No, well, it's attacked furiously was I think in the autopsy report a furious heart attack or something like that. Where I was like, I don't know how. That's why they call it a heart attack. It's like,
Yeah, but I think in Wallace's case, no, he died in an auto accident, but there's suspicion that his brakes were tampered with, and I think Clint Peoples was a legendary Texas lawman who was investigating that and some other cases, and then Peoples ultimately was killed in murky circumstances too.
now learning about kind of LBJ and kind of this rise to power over kind of blood in a sense. I mean, do you can you find this anywhere else with any other politicians? I mean, obviously we talk about assassinations in the 60s. There's not that many lone assassins. Like if you noticed after the 60s and kind of more towards maybe I would say early 70s, there's no more talks about lone assassins or any types of deals like that. And you mentioned something beginning with Allen Dulles. Well, Allen Dulles said that all political assassinations throughout history have been done by lone assassins except for Abraham Lincoln. He stated saying that to, I don't know if it was members of his commission at the time, but there is a video audio recording tape of that. So I'm just curious where you could find any other thing, if this was the start of politics, if this is how politics always went. We mentioned an earlier thing with LBJ with the Box 13 scandal, and the whole LBJ is like one figure out of the whole history bunch where I was like, you are the darkest and dirtiest one. But I'm sure it's like that with many politicians. You could translate that to Kennedy's affairs. You could translate that to many other things. Where I'm just curious if you had anything that made you want to look into any other people and try and find if there was anything similar that had a background. Like you could look into J. Edgar Hoover and see the horrible background that guy had.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think we're naive to believe that is unique and that American politicians aren't ruthless like in other countries in rising to power.
Well, it's my government. My government can't do wrong. That's American exceptionalism.
Yeah, exactly. And I've looked. I mean, if you look into the Clintons in Arkansas or Obama, I've looked done books on the Clintons and Obama, and there's a very dark history in both cases there too. With the Clintons, um, well, there are a lot of there's the Clinton body count, and some, of course, you can't verify, and there are a lot of names on there that may have nothing to do with Clinton, but there are some names that you can't, there does seem to be a strong connection to Clinton. For instance, when Clinton like was running for president in '92, there were figures who turned up dead who had a lot of information on the MENA, because Clinton was tied in with the CIA and oversaw this major, drug arms smuggling operation out of the MENA, Arkansas, to the Nicaraguan Contras. And there was a lot of money laundering going on in Arkansas banks and people turned up dead. I mean, Jerry Parks was one person. He was had been a security guard with for Clinton, and I believe worked in the Arkansas police. And he had traveled with Clinton to MENA, and he had a huge file. And his wife, Jane Parks, had rented Roger Clinton a apartment. She managed an apartment complex, and she overheard Roger and Bill having sex orgies with underage girls and having cocaine. He's partying, so he knew everything about the Clinton, partying with the cocaine. So he had a huge file of all this incriminating material, and then he was murdered in a mafia style assassination, and this was before the 1992 election. And I think he was threatening to go public. He had a falling out with Clinton. And there are other people. Gary Johnson lived near the woman Clinton had a long-term affair with, Jennifer Flowers, and he had all this surveillance camera footage of Clinton going to Flowers' apartment. And he wasn't murdered, but he got badly beaten up by some of Clinton's goons. And then the case of Vince Foster, and there are other cases. There are a lot of suspicious deaths in Arkansas. There's the boys on the track story of these boys who got killed and because they witnessed some drug drops. And many people associated with that case got killed. And Clinton blocked the investigation. And Linda Ives, the mother of one of the boys, said, "Well, Bill didn't directly kill my son, but I consider him as guilty in the murder of my son and the others because he was clearly protecting a criminal machine that was behind the murder of her son and behind these drug operations. So, he didn't always directly pull the trigger, but he was covering up crimes and murders. And, people who had insider information about him turned up dead. So you can compare that with Johnson. And then in the case of Obama, there's this suspicious case of Donald Young, who was in the church with Reverend Wright and was a campaign staffer for Obama, and he was part of a group of gay men, and allegedly he had an affair with Obama, and it's come to light that Obama was gay or bisexual. This is and not a conspiracy. It's in the David Garrow wrote a thousand page biography of Obama and did all kinds of research on his background. And he uncovered letters from Obama to a girlfriend where he's discussing basically that he was gay and that it was more convenient. He said something like it was more convenient for him to go publicly with women. I forget the exact words, but the leather made clear that he was gay, so that that maybe bisexual, but that so in the Young case, it's believed that Young had an affair with Obama, and that he was murdered on the eve of the 2008 election, and Obama is a key suspect, and Donald Young's mother came out and said that she thought Obama was involved. And there are three men who got killed who were in Reverend Wright's church, three black gay men, and they're all linked with Obama. I guess he felt that they would elect a black, but not a gay black man, especially if he was lying about his relationship with his wife Michelle. I don't know for sure if Obama, Obama, there's evidence that would indicate he's a top suspect, let's just say, in that crime. And there's a lot of dirty things he did. He was allied with the underworld, and this figure, Tony Rezko, was Obama's top donor from the beginning of his political career. And Rezko went to jail, just like Billy Sol Estes. Rezko went to jail for at least 10 years. He was tied with organized crime in Chicago. And Obama did all kind of corrupt thing, like Rezko gave him a home, because Rezko also owned real estate, and he was screwing over the black community. He was like a slumlord, and he also gave Obama a choice deal for a home he bought in Chicago, where Obama paid much below the value, and it was part of a campaign donation. They were kind of hiding his donations by having Obama purchase a home from him, but for a much lower price than the home was actually worth. And Rezko again was an underworld figure. So, the historical pattern is there where, and I think a lot of it is because of the money, the levels of money that are needed to be raised in politics, puts political aspirants binds them with these, very shady. I mean, most of the very wealthy people in our society often have made their money in very shady ways. And then you have elements of the underworld who have a lot of money who are eager to corrupt political figures or try and, curry favor with them. So, in some ways, it's part of the political game. And it takes, certain kinds of individual who succeed in politics are those with a lack of moral scruples and that are big time gamblers in the sense that they risk going to jail and they associate themselves with these kind of the Rezcos, the Billy Sol Estes, and they're willing at time to kill to preserve their reputation or power. And I think if you look at Clinton and Obama, you'll see similar things as with Johnson. And I don't know, I haven't studied, a lot of time that history is suppressed. If you look at presidents historically, how many of them engage in these kind of ruthless practices? I don't know. I mean, we know the record as president, a lot of them was very bad. They did many unethical things as presidents. There was a lot of, corruption flourished under certain particular administrations. Uh, but the extent to which they would have carried out killings, to get in office. I don't know historically how often that occurred. If that's a more recent phenomenon because of the growth of the American empire and the amount of power these presidents have. Uh, but I mean, the Bush family as well. There are books that would implicate the Bush family in murders. And there's a book by Roger Stone called The Bush Organized Crime Family. And Stone is a political operative, so some people dismiss him because they say, "Oh, it's just political." But the books are really well researched, and it's opposition research. Uh, and there's strong evidence that Bush, yeah, I mean Bush was in the CIA, George H.W. Bush, and you can connect him to like the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan with John Hinckley was very well connected with the Bush family. Uh, so that's just one example. And Jeb Bush like bragged to people that he could have people killed or put away. Often they would set them up for crimes so that they would be in prison for life. Bush was involved with drug smuggling. Jeb Bush and I think George W. Bush were involved in drug smuggling operations, and lots of people got killed to protect uh, their reputation or their implication in those plots. And their whistleblowers have come out and said, people who knew Jeb Bush, like you can read Al Martin's book, The Conspirators. He was involved with the Iran-Contra affair, and he knew Jeb Bush very well and was involved in some covert activity with him. And he said, Jeb Bush threatened him that if he were to go public, he would end up like this guy. I think his name was Morales, who, like Bush said, oh, he'll be in prison for life and he'll never got out. And when he was supposed to be, this guy Morales was, connected in the Iran-Contra, because George H.W. Bush was really a key figure in Iran-Contra. But yeah, this guy was given a long jail term, and then when it was his time to get out, he slipped and fell in the shower or something and died, hit his
Stay
head.
away
But
from showers and tall buildings. That's all I gotta say. I want to ask, bringing it back to the JFK assassination, could you maybe give a little background on Harold Byrd and also maybe some, I don't know, what you were able to uncover about his life a little bit? Just it helps me understand because obviously I know him as the owner of the sixth floor building or the what the museum is now, and I know a little bit about the article about the auctioning of the window, and I think he was on a hunting trip at the time of the Kennedy assassination, but then afterwards he got those military contracts you were mentioning that were approved by Johnson, like millions and millions of dollars. So I mean, that seems a little bit corrupt if you talk about his political friends somehow getting in charge of giant military contracts and spending.
exactly, yeah. And on the latter point, Johnson like was their cash cow in the Vietnam War. They made huge profits off it, since he was heavily invested in LTV, which produced the Corsair bomber that was used quite heavily in Vietnam. And he bought the stocks right around the time of the JFK assassination. He bought a huge number of stocks in LTV as if he knew that there would be a huge escalation in Vietnam uh, with his friend Johnson in there. So yeah, there's brazen profiteering, and yeah, his background. Well, he published an autobiography in the 1970s that interested listeners can consult. It's called, I think, An Endangered Species, and he talks about how he made his fortune in the oil fields in Texas in the 1920s, I believe, around 1930s. And he was like mentored by one of the top Texas oil wildcatters. He came from a distinguished family, and I think it was his uncle or was a notorious, well-known conservative congressman who was very influential in the conservative movement. I believe it was a senator from Virginia. So he came from a politically well-connected family and had a strong conservative worldview. And that's one reason he and others in his circle hated John F. Kennedy because Kennedy threatened to repeal the oil depletion allowance, and that was a subsidy to the oil industry because it was claimed that oil was a finite reserve, so it shouldn't be taxed. And Kennedy, was threatening to remove that. So they hated Kennedy largely for that reason. And yeah, he's just very conservative. He did have some fascist leanings, and he had traveled to Nazi Germany in the 30s and had a relationship with one of Himmler's former commanders, and seemed to have some sympathies for Nazi Germany. So he was really a far right. And like Kennedy, like I've analyzed Kennedy's policies, and I sometimes have a debate or argument with some people about this. I take the position that Kennedy was not really that radical or leftist. He was not the same as like Roosevelt or Henry Wallace. That he was more of a forerunner of in many ways the corporate Democrats. Although I would put him in the middle between like the Wallace, Roosevelt, today like a Bernie Sanders type who's more populist Democrat who would really go after the large corporations, and then like the corporate Democrat, the Clinton Obama, who just give everything to the corporations. I would put Kennedy kind of in the middle, but I don't see him as like a crusader for the working class in any way or an anti-imperialist. I mean, he championed a lot of, he favored covert operations around the world and counterinsurgency. And he set up the special group on counterinsurgency under his brother Bobby Kennedy to carry out counterinsurgency operations around the world, including Vietnam and the Operation Mongoose to overthrow Castro. But the far right, still saw him as too liberal, and in the mentality, and we see it today. Trump called Kamala Harris and Joe Biden socialists or Marxists, but I would consider Biden and Harris corporate Democrats. So I think it's the same in that time. The far right hated Kennedy and associated him with leftist policy when he was really not a leftist. But they hated him and wanted his removal, and a lot of it was self-interest because of what you're pointing out, the military contracts he gained under Johnson and the well, particularly the boom to the military company that he owned and the CIA companies that he owned, because Johnson really was always very close to the CIA and supportive of the CIA, whereas Kennedy was starting to concentrate, and that's one reason the CIA hated him. He was taking power away from the CIA, and the Special Group on Counterinsurgency was headed by his brother Bobby, and the CIA had very limited presence on that group that was very key to carrying out foreign policy under Kennedy. And he was not as hawkish related to Vietnam. There's debate about whether Kennedy would withdraw or not, but it was clear that he didn't have the same hawkish instinct like Johnson to engage in a massive escalation of the Vietnam War and U.S. troop presence. So, but that led to huge profits for people like Byrd who were invested in military industry, and Brown and Root, were the other key Johnson supporter that got all the contract for building bases in Vietnam. So,
Have you ever listened to any of the LBJ tapes or any conversations with LBJ? There's the one with the creation of the Warren Commission where he's kind of strong arming a lot of the members. But then there's kind of conversations or there's hearsay from a lot of people that said that LBJ, and I think this is well known, that he always thought the communists were behind the assassination of President Kennedy. I think that's even in documentation and letters as well too, which makes it difficult because if he was the person that pulled the trigger, not pulled the trigger, but was part of the plot to kill Kennedy, then wouldn't you just stick with the official narrative? Like Alan Dulles always stuck with the official narrative. That's why a lot of people suspect him. But LBJ would voice skepticism on the official lone nut narrative and say, oh, it's probably some communist thing. They do it to us and we do it to them. And it's this back and forth thing that goes on.
yeah, I think because Johnson was trying to play up the Cold War angle, that was his strategy to divert attention from him. Yeah, maybe it was slightly different from Alan Dulles if he was playing up the lone nut. And Johnson was very smart. Probably he saw that a lot of people were suspicious, especially after Ruby killed Oswald, that there was a wider plot. So he was very clever in trying to link it to the communists and playing up these Cold War themes. And that could in turn rationalize his escalation of the Cold War, which he was intent on doing, and escalation of wars like Vietnam, which benefited his supporters financially.
When it came to the actual assassination, why didn't you choose anything else but LBJ? Was it because of Robert Morrow's work, or did you look at any other things, different theories? Because obviously, you enter this case, it becomes a million different theories, a million reasons why, a million reasons how, but only really happened one way. You mentioned a front shot. That I think all researchers or anyone who looks at it who believes conspiracy understands that there was a front shot. Some people say the South Knoll. Some people think it's the main grassy knoll that everyone mentions, and the number of witnesses' statements that were altered or not taken or changed that talked about seeing smoke come from the grassy knoll. I'm curious if you ever had any thoughts about any other factors. Like a lot of people think the CIA was mainly behind it.
Well, and yeah, another good book I can recommend that's just come out is by Sean Feder, and he also implicates Lyndon Johnson as well as elements of the Air Force. Well, yeah, I think the CIA, as far as the shots, yeah, I agree. I think the evidence it clearly shows that, and that there's strong evidence, and the Feder book really goes into detail, and he did some incredible research and interviewed some key people to show how they altered Kennedy's body, and that there were two coffins. And actually, Johnson was very clever in helping in the cover up. And there were two coffins, and this gave them the time to actually work on the body and manipulate the body so as to cover up how he got killed. And now we have this Secret Service agent who spoke about the extra bullets in the limousine, Paul Landis. So there were a lot of bullets. There looks like there are shots coming from all different sides, including from the Dow Tex building. Um, yeah, the forensic evidence makes clear that the official story is implausible. I mean, from the beginning, that was known because it would entail believing in the magic bullet theory, which defied the laws of physics, so that somehow this bullet went downward and then upward into John Connolly. And we also know that Oswald was a very poor shot, so from his army career. So it'll only take a master sniper to hit it from the sixth floor. So I think the just the physical crime scene evidence makes clear that there were many different shooters, and that yeah, he was shot from the front, and that the Oswald thesis is impossible. Um, but what was the other thing I was going to
Well, I was
mention?
going to ask you the LBJ photograph. I'm sure you've seen it, but the wink photo. What are your thoughts on that one? Obviously, a lot of people point to that as like source of his involvement or just showing that obviously he had something to do with it. To me, it just looks really, really bad. Like that's a horrible thing to do when you're trying to get sworn in, which he didn't need to be sworn in at the time. He could have waited. But he wanted press there. He wanted everyone there to get photos of this to have his moment while he had Jackie Kennedy standing beside him in a blood-soaked dress of her husband's blood and a tear on her face. I mean, it doesn't look good. And then not even a second later, he's turning to someone else on the plane and giving him a good old wink.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and in general, his behavior would indicate his guilt, and it showed his complete insensitivity. Like I think he did everything to uh, as far as just Jackie, instead of trying to comfort her, he like had her sit in the back, and then the plane, and then they were celebrating on the plane ride there. Johnson and his cronies on the flight back to Washington, they were drinking heavily and celebrating after the president was killed. So just all kinds of behavior just makes him look guilty. I mean, I guess it's not definitive courtroom proof, but it would add to your suspicion the way he was behaving. And just his general character as somebody who had no human empathy, a cold, calculating person who can carry out such a political murder.
Did you ever look into his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover?
Yes, I know they were very, very close. They were, in fact, neighbors in Washington. And Hoover was obviously a key figure in the cover-up. Uh, and Hoover, yeah, stood to benefit because Kennedy was going to force him to retire, but he was able to stay on under Johnson and stay the FBI director until his death. And of course, that was probably necessary because Hoover had done so many illegal things that if he was out of the power, he would be liable to be investigated and could spend his twilight years in prison. So this is a matter of almost necessity for these kind of corrupt people who basically lived a life of crime. And it's like you see in dictatorships in the third world, they desperately try and cling to power because otherwise they're going to jail. And America, again, back to our point about American exceptionalism, we think we're better, and we have this God-given a mission to spread democracy around the world. But when you critically look at American democracy, you find a lot of parallels with countries around the world where you have these ruthless Machiavellian type figures who do whatever it takes and manipulate the legal system to their advantage. I mean, Johnson was able to control. It's almost amazing how one man could control the legal system, like in Texas. Um, he had, control over so many judges and lawyers, and you find that with Clinton as well. When he was the governor, like one book I read about Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas said he was more powerful than Boss Tweed, who ran New York City in the Gilded Age period and was known for being more like a mafia type figure. And Clinton also had control over judges, and that's how he was able to suppress investigation and into all the criminal thing that were going on with the Mina operation.
When it came to looking at like the Clintons and it came to looking at Johnson, were you shocked that there was that much power that was left in the hands of like rich oilmen or just other rich influences that were going into not the president's actions on things, but somewhat the president's actions and our government's actions? I mean, with LBJ, it's very shocking to me when I started looking at articles by H.L. Hunt and many other rich oil people back then that were I mean, I know people say that, oh, Kennedy won the election because his dad and the organized crime helped him win or whatever it was. You could say the same thing with LBJ because LBJ had so many oilman friends that talked about being able to, pay a large amount or get LBJ to even run to go be vice president. So it's not like there's one person. I'm sure there's a lot of election tampering and I'm sure it happens every election. I'm not saying any election is rigged. I'm just saying I believe there's some small bit of influence. And if you look at the old historical stuff like the 60s election, I mean, yeah, I think Kennedy won it, but at the same time, I can't deny all these different articles and things that I come across and different documentation stating that there was this large amount of influence out of Chicago. There was this large influence out of Texas. That's why LBJ and JFK were going to Texas together. A lot of people think to make sure that they can get people to support this ticket that they thought everyone would be happy with to have LBJ on JFK's ticket.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think, and there's a good book by Jonathan Marshall, and I'm blanking again also on the title, but he showed the infiltration of organized crime in American politics. Going back to the Truman presidency, he sees it kind of crucial. I guess Roosevelt was more clean. Yeah, and I mean, I don't think every president, committed these was as ruthless as Johnson. Like, I don't, there's no
Jimmy
evidence in the
Carter won
world.
it fair and square. He's probably our nicest
Yeah.
president.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Carter, you've seen his post-presidency, all the good things he's done, but there are these ruthless people out there, and they often get on top. And yeah, Marshall showed that organized crime really infiltrated politics under Truman, who was connected to the Pendergast political machine in the state of Missouri. And Pendergast basically bankrolled Truman's rise to power. And Truman was kind of a simpleton who was the last president who didn't even have a college degree, and he gave all kinds of favors to Pendergast. And there was also a fraud in elections involving Pendergast that like Truman was covering up, and he protected him from prosecution when he was president. So Marshall sees that as a turning point, and most post-war presidents had ties with organized crime. I mean, I think the Kennedys had through the father, Joseph P. Kennedy, who was a bootlegger and connected with organized crime. But Nixon also had ties with organized crime, and so did Johnson. Yeah, and some of these oil barons in Texas, like Clinton Murchison, were connected with the CIA and organized crime. And I think Johnson had connection with Carlos Marcello. And there's other evidence. I can't forget. I can't remember off the top of my head all the details, but I know. And Morrow is the top expert. So on Johnson, he knows like everything about him, and he knows of his ties with organized crime, and I think it's pretty salient. And I mean, basically, he operated as a gangster, killing his way to power, and then he was the guy that orchestrated escalate the Vietnam War. So I mean, he was running U.S. foreign policy, like a gangster in a way.
What were you hoping to accomplish by writing an article about the Kennedy assassination? Like, well, obviously, it's not as much as there's polls that show that a lot of people believe it's conspiracy. It's just we're 60, what, 1 years now past. The anniversary was just in November, and I didn't see any media talking about anything about the anniversary for Kennedy. Last year on the 60th, they did. Not this year. And we don't see a lot of media articles now. Everyone's wondering when files are going to be released. But besides out of research circles of the JFK assassination, there's not a large interest that I've seen amongst either people my age, people younger, even maybe some people in their 50s and 60s that are interested in. So I'm curious what your thoughts were when you were writing this and what your reception has been from it.
Well, my feeling is that it is a very significant event in American history, behind just the human level, that it's an unsolved crime, and that a man was killed, whether he was a saint or not. No man should be murdered, and people should be held accountable for carrying out those crimes, especially when it involves major, political ramifications. And in this case, I think many analysts would argue that the Kennedy assassination, combined with the other assassinations of the 1960s, had huge ripple effects on American politics that persist to this day. It really destroyed all the liberal leaders of the 1960s and paved the way for the ascendance, the conservative ascendancy, which the late 20th, early 21st century will be remembered for, and the triumph of corporate power, because Kennedy was, although I don't group him with Roosevelt and Wallace, were to me leaders who stood up more to large corporations, and Wallace was promoting a peaceful relation with the Soviets. Now Kennedy came up as a Cold Warrior, although he may have been shifting. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was starting to make more overtures toward Khrushchev and back channel diplomacy. So he could have, and his admirers believed that he was going to, shift U.S. foreign policy in a better direction. Um,
I don't know if he would have pulled out of Vietnam or not, to be honest with you. I'll say that. I'd like to think he would, but there's not any evidence. And that's like the one topic of discussion amongst researchers where they're either on one side or the other, and they get mad at you if you're not on their side. It's like, look, you can't
yeah, we
romanticize
don't know.
history.
Yeah, well, I published an article with Race, Class, and Corporate Power called "The Liberal Savior is Conservative: John F. Kennedy's Foreign Policy." And it's actually very critical of Kennedy's foreign policy, and argued against this kind of myth making. They want to make Kennedy into this liberal hero that he wasn't during his presidency, because he escalated the war in Vietnam considerably. He was the one to initiate the Strategic Hamlet program, to initiate Operation Ranch Hand, where they started spraying herbicides. And actually, the first, I did a lot of research at the Kennedy Library, and I used to live in Boston. And I was a naive graduate student at that point, 23 or 24 years old. And the first documents I saw, I was just ordering different documents, like looking Kennedy Vietnam. The first document I saw was a program to induce mass starvation in Viet Cong, supported areas in
And
Vietnam.
then your optimism as a young youth went out the window.
Yeah, this was like my education, what the U.S. government is really doing. So even under Kennedy, who I thought was this, great liberal hero, because I always, as a youth, supported liberal. And in the '88, like I cried my eyes out. That was the first election I really followed. Michael Dukakis, I thought he was this great humane figure, and he lost to the Bushes. I had a bad feeling about George W. Bush, as a kid. But so I identified more with the liberal, but I thought more positively of Kennedy. But yeah, well, then when I saw the documents, I saw what they were doing, and his administration was fixated with counterinsurgency and stamping out, guerrilla nationalist guerrilla movements and liberation movements, and they were adopting counterinsurgency all around the world. And I studied the Office of Public Safety, which was a covert program of police training. And Kennedy really ramped that up. And that was kind of an insidious way of advancing American power and often promoting highly repressive activity among foreign police force, to stamp out left-wing or communist or nationalist movements. So I'm not under any illusion about Kennedy and his foreign policy, but it still was trapped. And I agree with you. I think they created this myth after that he was this pacifist who was going to end Vietnam. I don't think he was going to escalate in the way Johnson did. I think he favored more covert operations, and he was committed to the regime in South Vietnam. He had actually been part of the American Friends of Vietnam, where the U.S. Was a lobby group to put in Diem as Ngo Dinh Diem as an anti-communist alternative to Ho Chi Minh, the communist in the north, and they were committed to building Diem up. And it was similar like Zelensky today. That a lot of what that group did was to spread propaganda to make like Diem was this great liberal figure who would bring a great democracy to Vietnam, like they claim about Zelensky. But really, there was a real dark side to Diem, like Zelensky. He was running underground counterinsurgency operation that the CIA was supporting through the 50s and 60s, and they were torturing people. They had a torture facility under the Saigon Zoo, and then he passed a law to execute them after 3 days with a military trial, no public trial. So it was really a very brutal dictatorship, and it triggered a Buddhist revolt. The famous images of monks immolating themselves. So, and that was a prelude to the war in Vietnam. And Kennedy was very central to the U.S. escalation involvement in Vietnam. And actually, Robert Kennedy, like he was pretty gung ho. It was only when the war became unpopular, like in 66, 67, that he actually changed because there was a set of interviews with Robert Kennedy. Like there was one interview in 64 after JFK was killed, and they said, would your brother have withdrawn U.S. troops from Vietnam? And he said no. But then in 67, an oral history he gave on the Kennedy Library, then he said he would, because then the war was unpopular. But 64, it wasn't yet unpopular, 65. So he changed what he said, and I think this myth developed. And like Arthur Schlesinger was a hagiographer, and Kennedy intellectual advisor, and then wrote this hagiography, Kennedy the Thousand Days. He said nothing about Kennedy withdrawing from Vietnam, and this was an attempt to kind of burnish Kennedy's image. But that book was written right after his assassination when Vietnam was still unpopular. So it was still a popular war. So like then that wouldn't have been a good thing to say, oh, Kennedy was going to withdraw because people thought of it as part of the Cold War crusade that they were behind. It was only when the anti-war movement developed and people changed into becoming anti-war when it was clear it was a bad war, they started saying, oh yeah, Kennedy would have taken us out. So I think like they created this myth about him, but that doesn't undercut the tragedy of his assassination and the brutality of the forces that were behind that assassination. And I think American government became even worse. I mean, there are always bad things that government leaders were doing, but the Kennedy assassination, others of the 60s, I think just destroyed the liberal movements and empowered some of the most vicious elements and so-called deep state, the Johnson type war hawks, and then you had the Cheney, Bush neoconservatives. So it was definitely a bad direction, as far as the trajectory of American government. So I think it is important to study, and it is important to understand some of the dark forces that exist in our political life, and also to understand that American politics is not dissimilar to other countries. And that I think should make us weary of this missionary like effort to spread democracy around the world when our democracy is deeply flawed. And we should try and improve our democracy first. And we should expose a important first step, I think, would be to have truth commissions to expose the truth about what went on. to recognize that, and then establish a pattern of trying to hold people accountable if they carry out crimes at a high level, not to allow them to get away with it, and that will improve our democracy here at home.
I'm going to ask you this because it hit along the same lines you were just mentioning, but do you think that the Kennedy assassination is kind of a predecessor to all the other stuff that comes later? Like when we talk about RFK's assassination, we talk about the obviously Fred Hampton assassination. This is just stuff that's been going on, and it seemed like it all really started to spark up after the Kennedy assassination. It seemed like the government was pretty good at finding something that works and being able to see that the public, as much like Alan Dulles said, doesn't read anyway. I mean, you read those Warren Commission volumes, I can tell you something. They don't match anything the report says, and it actually kind of contradicts itself when you actually start looking through the actual volumes of what they decided to print out. So I'm curious if you think that the Kennedy assassination, what your thoughts are on why you should look into it, why you should research it, why it is historically significant, and do you think that's it kind of was a forefront for the RFK assassination and stuff that came later?
Yes, I do. Well, firstly, I think that the people who were involved in the conspiracy and its cover up saw saw how they could get away with it, and they saw what works, and they used the same modus operandi in other assassinations or black flag operations. And with regard to Robert Kennedy, yes, I think the same forces who were behind the assassination of JFK were behind the assassination of Robert Kennedy, because Robert Kennedy, they couldn't allow him to become the president. In '68, he was capturing the Democratic Party leadership. He changed his tune. The Kennedys are very clever politicians, and Robert Kennedy had been a zealous Cold Warrior, the head of the special group on counterinsurgency. He orchestrated the Operation Mongoose, and he had been a hawk on Vietnam, but he saw the rise of the youth counterculture and the anti-war movement. He saw where the winds were blowing politically, and he repositioned himself as a strong liberal that would win the support. And he was fairly youthful. He was still young and youthful looking. And he had this kind of rock star, appearance, and so met him. He transformed himself into the anti-war candidate, and it was a success for him politically, and he was winning that primary. So they had to kill him because if he won the presidency, I mean, I think maybe it had something to do with Vietnam, because I think he would have followed through and ended the war in Vietnam, which had become very unpopular by then, and that was a popular move. But I think even more significantly, was that he would reopen the investigation, because he had doubts about the Warren Commission from the beginning. I think he suspected Johnson, and I have this in my article, like Jackie Kennedy suspected Johnson, Evelyn Lincoln suspected Johnson. He was the secretary. So, and Jackie, and so that gives you a clue that people in the Kennedy family knew that there was a conspiracy. They thought Johnson was behind it, and probably elements of the CIA. So, Bobby was going to reopen that investigation, and that would ruin Johnson and ruin people in the CIA and FBI. And I mean, he was clearly assassinated. I mean, it wasn't just a lone Sirhan. In fact, the evidence in the Robert Kennedy case shows that Sirhan couldn't have been the shooter, because firstly, there was like 8 or 10 bullets, and Sirhan only got 2 bullets off, but he was far away from Robert Kennedy, and Robert was shot from behind the ear, and it was a security guard that killed him.
Thane Eugene Caesar.
Exactly. And he worked for Lockheed Martin, and a wing that was attached to U.S. intelligence. And Sirhan was set up as a patsy, and they hypnotized him. So that was clearly a CIA broader operation, because Kennedy would revive the investigation. And then they had to make sure Teddy Kennedy didn't get in. So they likely set him up at Chappaquiddick, where he was, he allegedly drove off the pier with a woman who got killed tragically, a woman who, Mary Jo Kopechne, who had worked for Robert Kennedy. However, there is accounts I've read that cast serious doubt on the official story and point to Kennedy having been set up to ruin his political career, or at least make sure that he couldn't ascend to the presidency where he could reopen that investigation. So they set him up to look bad. And the story, it's likely she may have been killed beforehand, and they just set up the crime scene and they threatened him in some way um, so that he wouldn't reveal exactly what had transpired there. Or maybe they probably had, because the Kennedys had dark skeletons in their closet too, so including with women. So they probably had a lot of dirt on him. And at least he got to play out his career as an influential senator. So I bet they made some kind of deal with him that he could stay on as a senator, but that he would never, or it was implied that he could never be the president after this incident. So, and that's why, look, they've attacked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. viciously. I mean, the way he's been slandered in the media, and obviously it's probably because of his stance on COVID and his outspokenness against the pharmaceutical industry and challenging the COVID narrative. However, it also may link to his family, that they don't want him. They had to discredit him so he wouldn't be in a position, because he said that he's raised questions about the assassination of his uncle and his father, and he's, I think, tried to free Sirhan because he knows Sirhan was set up. And there's also JFK Jr. I think they have to target every member of that family. John F. Kennedy Jr. was a dashing, man who had started a George magazine and was planning to start his political career. And it was a good chance he would have captured the Democratic nomination at some point for the presidency. And he died in a very suspicious plane crash. And I've looked into that, and there's strong evidence of foul play in that plane crash. So it would seem to fit a pattern that they can't have any Kennedy in or near power to reopen the investigation.
I think it's called the Kennedy curse.
Yeah, exactly.
You've given me enough of your time, and I'm going to link your article in the description, just so people can be able to click on it and check out the. You have written extensively on the whole Kennedy LBJ matter, which I want people to see all the documentation and stuff you did include and the facts you do have in there. But is there a place where people can find any of your other links besides your Covert Action magazine?
Yes, I have a Substack called Too Hot for the Mainstream. Uh, so check that out, or Jeremy Kuzmarov at Substack. And yeah, I post my Covert Action magazine articles and different articles I wrote, and some also interviews. Like I'll post this interview there. So
Well, I appreciate you for hopping in on the Kennedy assassination. We need more researchers on that one. I could tell you that much.
yeah, it's been very fascinating, and I became convinced that Johnson played a key role. I think there's very, very strong evidence that I lay out in the article, including that people in the Kennedy inner circle believed it was Johnson, like Jackie Kennedy, and actually the Soviet KGB. Some of those documents were released at the end of the Cold War, and the KGB assessment was that Johnson was a central figure in it.
Everybody was concerned that the vice president was going to have a complete polar opposites of Kennedy's, and they were afraid and they wanted to know what the country was going to be like, and if any deals that they still made were still going to hold now that there's this new tyrant, in their opinion, taking over, which makes it only more interesting. But I try and stay away from the who. I try and focus on what we can show through documents. But I do appreciate you and your perspective, and I also do appreciate the work you have done, and glad to have you part of the Kennedy community. Maybe I'll get you in one of these panels I do with the JFK assassination. But I do appreciate the time again, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.